Welcome back to episode 5 of Right or Wrong. Let's get into it. Today we're talking about the unexpected twist in the Texas cold case, where the victim was a bridesmaid in her own killer's murder. Yeah, let's get into it. By the way, this is explicit content talking about murder, rape, terrible, terrible things, and yeah. This case is about Mary Catherine Edwards. On January 14th, 1995, it was Saturday. Catherine, as most people called her, didn't show up for a family lunch, and she wasn't answering her phone. When her mother and father went back to check on her, they had to see what no parent should ever. Because she snuck in and out of her room, she was murdered and attacked. This is a 911 operator. It says, quote, "What happened, ma'am?" End quote. Mary Ann Edwards says, quote, "We came over here and found her. Please send someone over," end quote. 911 operator says, "Okay, we're sending somebody over, ma'am. Is she or was she not shot?" Ann Edwards says, we can't tell. Catherine was 31. Diana Coe remembers hearing the news. The sisters, both school teachers, look so similar and alike. Everyone had trouble telling them apart, especially their young friends. "Helena Adams, Miss Edwards, was my second-grade teacher," she says. Helena Adams remembers being in a classroom. "Most of us grew up in a pretty tough environment, and being around Miss Edwards was a joy." That was from Helena. Aaron Lewin says, "Originally they believed that she might have been drowned, but there wasn't enough fluid in the lungs, and then it kinda came up as a suffocation by compression." Helena says, "I just remember being told that our teacher wouldn't make it to class that day. Everyone was just crying." Diana says, "My mom was the one that told me. She said, quote, 'Have you not heard about Catherine?' End quote. And I go, quote, 'My Catherine?' End quote. She'd been friends with Catherine and her twin sister Allison since middle school." Diana says, quote, "I was new to the area, so I knew nobody, and they just started talking to me, asking my name, and we were friends from that point forward." End quote. The sisters, both school teachers, look so much alike everyone had trouble telling them apart, especially their young students. Quote, "Miss Edwards was my second-grade teacher," says Helena. Helena Adams remembers being in her classroom. "Most of us grew up in a pretty rough environment, and being around Miss Edwards was a joy." In weeks after the murder, police found and focused on tracing the serial numbers of the handcuffs, but came up empty. They also zeroed in on an old boyfriend, David Perry. Aaron Lewin says, quote, "They focused on him early because there was no forced entry," end quote. But Perry was out of town that night. He gave a DNA sample and it was not a match. David Perry says, quote, "I wasn't there, it's not me," end quote. The crime scene DNA stayed pretty well preserved, and the years dragged on until forensic science changed. By 2018, there is a way to take the DNA left at a crime scene and search for biological relatives. A program GLEDmatch scarves all up in the DNA from people who agree to share it with the law enforcement and upload it when they use sites like Ancestry.com and 23andMe. Aaron Lewin says, "Ranger Bless approached me and he asked if I thought we had a case that would fit the bill for that type of investigation. I said, quote, 'Absolutely. I know the perfect case for this,' end quote. And it was the Catherine Edwards case. So in April 2020, the DNA from Catherine Edwards' crime scene went to Othram, a lab outside of Houston, for testing. Aaron Lewin says they would give us familiar matches, and from there we would start trying to build family tree to get us closer to our suspect. The number of our names to pursue was overwhelming." Aaron Lewin says, "When the family tree began to grow beyond my computer screen," he laughs, "I started to get a little bit confused, and that's when Tina jumped on board." Aaron Lewin's wife, Tina Lewin, an auto crime detective, began using her off hours to help sort it through. Lewin says the matches were all Cajun. "Cajun ancestry?" says Natalie. Tina Lewin says yes. Morales says, "Coming from the Louisiana area." Tina Lewin says, "Yes." Tina Morales says, "Specifically." Tina Lewin, "Particularly Clapham, Louisiana," she says. So, Tina Lewin went back to Catherine's journal looking for clues. And as she was building out the branches, one of the names on the family tree kept coming up. And when they called her, they found out that LaPointe had been building her family tree. And then they found something that changed the course of the investigation. LaPointe was known professionally as, quote, "the gene hunter," end quote, and already killed out of working these cases. She identified one of the women buried along Interstate Highway 45 in the Texas Killing Field case, and she agreed to lend her expertise, even if it meant taking a hard look at her own relatives. It was a complicated, multi-layered process using publicly available DNA, birth, and death records, finding parents, siblings, and cousins. The tree grew up and down and sideways. There were almost 7,500 names. All the while, Tina Lewin hardly slept, working through most nights, knowing there was a killer still out there. Hunkered down at their computers day after day, constantly back and forth on the phone, Tina Lewin and genealogist Cheryl Lapointe are quickly becoming great partners. And when they needed DNA, they turned to Dr. Tina Lewin's husband, Aaron Lewin, one Texas Ranger Brandon Bess. Once the uploads were completed to the killer's DNA, if the amount of shared genetic material was low, they knew it was a dead end. After almost 3 months of ups and downs, the nearly non-stop work, Lapointe hit pay dirt. She was working a family line very distinctly related to her own. This was a major lead. A family in Catherine's town with 2 sons who went to Forest Park High, the same school Catherine did, at around the same time. Lapointe says, quote, "I'm tired. I'm going to bed. I turned my cell phone off and fell asleep on the sofa. And when I woke up the next morning, my phone had just blown up." End quote. The first time I ran was Clayton. And when I came across his prior conviction for sexual assault, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I'm like, quote, "This is our guy," end quote. In 1991, a 19-year-old woman told police that Clayton Foreman bound her hands and raped her. She also had gone to Frank's Forest Park High School, where Clayton was the manager of the football team. Clayton Foreman was convicted but was also given probation and time off with a fine. And then they found another connection. It went all the way back to Dina Coe, Catherine's friend from middle school. In high school, Coe fell madly in love with her boyfriend, had graduated 3 years ahead of her, and they got engaged. And when she started planning her wedding, she immediately turned to her old friends Catherine and Allison. And the groom, the man Coe married back in 1982, now he was their number one suspect, Clayton Foreman. In hindsight, there were signs. When Coe found out about Clayton Foreman's legal troubles, the wedding was less than 3 months away. But she never got any details, and her fiancé explained it away. Coe's sister Ann Anderson and her brother Scooter DeLeo were not so sure, and neither were their parents, who wanted her off to call it off. Dina and Clayton Foreman stayed married for a little more than 11 years, and they had a son. The relationship began to fray over Foreman lying about their finances and ended after he had an affair. And looking back, Coe can see that he had an unhealthy fascination with police officers and the tools of their trade, like handcuffs. When Catherine was killed, they were divorced, but Coe remembers calling her ex-husband to talk about it. With all the mounting evidence, Foreman needed to be found. She was 60 and no longer living in Beaumont. They quickly traced him back to Reynoldsburg, Ohio. The likelihood that the DNA belonged to Clayton Foreman was a big number, 461 septillion. It doesn't get any bigger than that, says Lapointe. And that was all they needed. Det Aaron Lewin and Ranger Bess were about to hop on a plane to Ohio, ready to face the man they sure thought had killed Catherine. And while they were doing that, Tina Lewin says to visit Coe. When Ranger Bess and Lewin arrive at Franklin County Sheriff's Office to confront Clayton Foreman, they have a cover story. It's about a lost item from one of Foreman's Uber rides. It was April 29, 2021, 26 after Catherine Edwards was murdered, and they were sure that they were sitting in front of the man who murdered her. "We were asking you to visit, which was about the crime, and we're investigating, okay?" says Ranger Bess. Natalie Foreman says, "Did he immediately go? Uh-oh, you know." And then they have a long conversation in the interrogation room about what happened and all kinds of things like that. Basically bounding multiple handcuffs around this man. 1, 2, I see 3 handcuffs to handcuff him. He's so large. Here at 60, sitting before them was the splitting image that could have been. Allison Edwards Branco, in court. "This is a picture of my sister Catherine, reliving the day she lost Catherine." And then the next thing we know, my mom and my dad drove up crying and told us. I mean, there were no words. She was dead. That was all that mattered. I didn't know how, what, or anything. I didn't know what happened to her. It was just that she was gone. That's all I knew. The pain and the loss was still so palpable. Helena Adams, Catherine Edwards' student when she was 7, is now 37 and sat in the courtroom nearly every day. Detective Lewin and genealogist LaPointe, along with other crime lab technicians, walked the jury through the process of genealogy and DNA match. After 7 days of prosecution testimony, the defense calls no witness and Attorney Burbank closes. Mary Catherine Edwards was a schoolteacher and was found dead in her hometown nearly 30 years ago, but the case didn't see a conviction until earlier this year, with the jury took less than an hour to determine that Clayton Foreman, someone Edwards went to high school with and stood as her brideswoman in one of his weddings, was her killer. That's a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. That's terrible. Murder's bad. So now we're going to do a segment called the Nicole segment, where we go back and we find out a certain place where certain things could be changed. Like, with the man, he really could not have killed her. He really didn't need to do that at all. In fact, there wasn't really a motive. He was just insane. So he didn't really have to do that. She was just laying in bed, all safe and tucked in. That's really unfortunate. Again, not victim blaming. And this is episode 5 of Right or Wrong. And yeah, I'll see you guys later.